listener production.
Hey, Benzion Siebert here for The Briefing.
For the first time in 200 years, women have made it to the presidency of the Republic.
That's Claudia Sheinbaum, elected over the weekend as Mexico's first female president. It's a massive moment in the history of the country, which has an overwhelmingly Catholic population and has traditionally leaned patriarchal on the role of women in society. Sheinbaum will also become the country's first Jewish president. She is a climate scientist, and she's about to assume office at a time of major crisis along the US border. On top of all that, the new president is coming to power during an election marred by appalling violence. 38 political candidates have been assassinated in a wave of cartel violence in this election alone. Luis Gomez Romero was a senior advisor to former Mexican President Vicente Fox Quesada, and he's now a senior lecturer in human rights, constitutional law, and legal theory at the University of Wollongong. Luis, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing. Tell us, who is Claudia Sheinbaum?
Claudia Sheinbaum, she was the mayor of Mexico City. She is a physicist, and she has a PhD on the energy engineering with an environmental focus. So she's an expert in clean energies. And she is now the first woman to have been elected as president of Mexico. And she's also now the first Jewish president of Mexico, a country that has 70% of Catholic population.
So a very significant moment in Mexican history. I suppose this also comes at a particularly significant time in the Me Too movement in Mexico, because there was the former Mexican diplomat Andre Romer, who was arrested in Israel and maybe extradited to Mexico. How significant is this moment from a gender perspective in Mexico?
Well, what it is signaling is a change in Mexican society, in Mexican culture. Mexico has gone a very long way from the time of those infamous femicides. Femicide is a hate crime, the killing of a woman because she's a woman, that were in the headlines in the late 1990s, the femicides of Ciudad Juárez in the border with the US. And then there was an overhaul of Mexican laws and Mexican policies that has led to this moment, because by changing the norms and the law, the legislation, the policies, the culture has changed. Mexico was famous. Is still famous because of its macho culture. Here I'm using the Spanish term because everyone understands it. That's the toxic masculinity. And yet in this time, it is a woman who has achieved an extraordinary, according to the quick count, the official results that have been published so far of the election, she got 58% of the votes. And the candidate of the opposition, who was trailing her, got around 30% of the votes. So if you think about it, then 90% of Mexicans voted for a woman. So it seems now that Mexican society has changed for good in that aspect.
There is another thing that Mexico is unfortunately very infamous for, and that's cartel violence. Some 38 candidates for office were killed in this election. Can you explain why this election has been so bloody? What are the causes?
Well, this is a result of the policies on public security adopted by the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is also Sheinbaum's mentor. The military has been involved in law enforcement since 2006, and this has conducted to an increase in violence because the military is quite brutal in its response to crime, and it is also quite ineffective. There is no investigation. If you think about the police, even in popular culture, the police investigates, collects evidence, prepares It's so that the indicted subject is presented for trial. And the mentality of the army is the mentality of eliminating the enemy. So on the one hand, you have that violence with the army, and on the other hand, what the president said at the beginning of his term, the current president, López Obrador, said was that he was not going to persecute the criminals as previous governments have done. He infamously said, hawks, not bullets, to indicate precisely that there was going to be a shift in policy. What happened in practice was that the army doesn't intervene unless there is a scandal, unless there are corpses left in the roads, and then if there is not a scandal, then the army just abstains from intervening, and there are many gangs, many groups that are terrorizing communities. This has created pockets in the Mexican territory. Sociologists, anthropologists who are working on the ground claim that it's around 30% of the territory of the country over which the state has no control currently. So in these pockets, those criminals are the ones who are basically running the government, including the elections. So if the candidates didn't give them any guarantees on that their trade would continue without any major obstacles, without any major burdens, then it is likely that they would be murdered. And unfortunately, indeed, there were around 38 candidates that were killed, and around 300 people related to the organization of the elections who also violently lost their lives.
What can the new Mexican president do about all the violence?
Well, one thing would be shifting the policy and the law that relies on the military to undertake law enforcement tasks. Unfortunately, during the campaign, Claudia Sheinbaum did not give any indication that she was going to change this. She has basically promised to continue with López Obrador's policies and views on public security. And so one thing that is required is to just rebuild a civilian police force that is accountable for its work, for the way in which force is applied, and crimes are prosecuted, investigated, etc. And on the other hand, there is a need to address the social causes of crime. There is a group, and this has been identified, of young men. It is generally young men who are disaffected with society. They are very angry because they have been made redundant by the inequality and the lack of opportunities. So López Obrador is famous for, the current president, for implementing a series of social programs. These social programs should address these disaffected young men, to put it in very colloquial terms, to catch them young and then prevent them from joining the gangs, from joining those criminals. So those would be the two potential shifts in policy. One that I think it's not likely to happen. That is the structuring and rebuilding of a civilian police force. The other to readdress the social programs to target those groups that are now being recruited by the criminals.
As we record this episode, the US President Joe Biden looks poised to sign an executive order that would allow him to severely limit the number of asylum seekers that can come across the Mexican-US border. How will the new president be dealing with the relationship with the US? How will she manage that issue?
Well, I think that López Obrador as well, and I refer constantly to López Obrador because López Obrador is her mentor, and she relied on López Obrador's popularity to good extent to achieve her extraordinary results in this election. So he initially promised that he was not going to allow anyone to make a piñata out of Mexico. A piñata, you hit the piñatas. So, and he was explicitly referring to Trump. In the end, he ended up submitting basically to what Trump wanted. That was the Stay in Mexico program. So then if an asylum seeker arrives to the U.S., then while their request is processed, they remain in Mexico. Given the levels of insecurity in Mexico, under international law, this is not the way in which the United States should be processing its applications for asylum. How is the new government going to address this issue? Well, I think that this would be my wish. I don't know if this is what the new government is going to do, but what would be sensible to do is to remind the United States that this is a regional problem. So it's not Mexico, it's not Central America. There are conditions of inequality and violence that have been produced by, of course, by local governments, by the governments in Central America, by the government in Mexico, but also by the intervention of the United States. And as a regional program, as a transnational program, then it needs to be solved with cooperation. And certainly that cooperation cannot consist in just keeping the immigrants or those who are seeking asylum in Mexico while their applications are processed, given the situation of insecurity that Mexico is living. In Mexico, sadly, 80 persons are killed per day and 1 person disappears per hour.
That's really awful. Well, thanks so much for your time and thanks for explaining that, Luis.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Luis Gomez Romero there. That's it for the briefing today. If you enjoyed today's ep, please hit follow and share it with a friend. You can also check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Ben Sion Siebert. Catch you soon.